Hello, Internet humans, and welcome to Space Cadets, a podcast reviewing space-oriented science fiction films, boldly going where literally everyone else has gone before us. My name is Joel, also known as Crazy. With me is George.
Hello, everyone. I am the reason why he will sometimes be referred to as Crazy, just to confuse you all. So
Yes, it's an in-joke. Don't question it.
It isn't a joke. It will not be questioned. So this week on Space Cadets, we're deciding to take a look at Event Horizon, a film from 1997 that Crazy and I both viewed several times. And well, we'll let you know how we feel about it when we get to the actual review proper. Now, again, this is our first episode, so just as a sort of corollary for everyone who's joining us, we've made a sort of very brief preamble episode. It's very short. It just goes into a little more detail about who we are and exactly why we're doing this and what we sort of hope to follow and pursue and look into. So if you haven't listened to that already, it should be on our channel just before this episode. I'd strongly recommend sort of pausing it now and going to listen to that. All right, so hopefully you've listened to that preamble now, and without further ado, we'll get on to this week's review, which again is Event Horizon.
All right, let's do it.
All right, then. Hello again, everyone. As was hopefully outlined in the introduction, we're filming this before the introduction, so Lord knows what it sounds like. But hopefully, as we described, we will be looking at Event Horizon today. Event Horizon was a film, it sort of came and went very much in the late 90s. It didn't do terribly well in terms of critical or sort of general audience reception at the time. But I think you'd agree, Crazy, it's probably fair to say that it's sort of gained greater following as the years have gone on.
Yeah, certainly. And again, it's a shame that it didn't do as well as it really could have, because it was, I think, a genuinely good film. It stands over time as a genuinely decent film.
Excellent. So before we sort of get to the synopsis, do you want to just run us through sort of the basic cast and crew?
Okay, so the film was directed by Paul W.S. Anderson and written by Philip Eisner. Now, as for the cast, we have Captain Miller, who's played by Lawrence Fishburne, Dr. William Weir, played by Sam Neill, Peters, Medtech, played by Kathleen Quinlan, Lieutenant Stark, by Jolie Richardson, Cooper, played by Richard T. Jones, Justin, played by Jack Noseworthy, DJ, played by Jason Isaacs, and lastly Smith, played by Sean Pertwee.
Cool. And I think you have some figures about how it did roughly in terms of budget and the revenue it brought in.
Let me check. Yeah, so the budget was around $60 million. I didn't look into the math too closely, but I think they fell a good few million shy of that budget in the box office. So,
yeah, and we'll see where the budget went, because it seems like, on the face of it seems like quite a lot for a sort of film at that time period. But
yeah,
we'll see where all that went. All right, so all prepared to get with us as we prepare to venture to that not at all ominous or desolate spaceship, the Event Horizon.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll start us off. So we have the opening titles over sort of a backdrop of a black hole, rather ominous. But then, as is customary in these sort of films, we then get an exposition text that, along with sort of describing that humanity has sort of expanded out into the solar system, it also outlines that in the year 2040, a research vessel known as the Event Horizon went to sort of the edge of the solar system and then all of a sudden disappeared, being the most costly space disaster in history. And then 7 years later, rather, in 2047, when the movie is set, there's now a new vessel that seems to want to go out there for some reason to sort of find out what transpired. And the camera then sort of shifts off that opening text, and we get a sort of very long view of a spaceship in orbit around what we later find to be Neptune. Although it's not technically revealed at the time, this is almost clearly the Event Horizon. And we get a sort of small inside look at the Event Horizon at this juncture, and it's, how would you describe it, Crazy?
Well, strange. I don't know. How would you describe it?
It's definitely it's definitely interesting. We'll get to the art direction as we go through, but yeah, it's obviously not the sort of it's obviously not been cared for a long time.
No.
Hardly. Anyway, though, we quickly transition very rapidly from this to to Sam Neill. Which I'll let you take over this scene.
So where's quarters? Just trying to remember how that bit starts.
So he wakes up in bed, doesn't he?
Of course, yes. Now it's at this point we see the nightmare, isn't it? The very first one.
Yep.
Yeah. So of course we see the nightmare. Where wakes up and he walks out, and I get this really nice view of this station that he's on. The station. It's a station, George.
It's a station. These stations.
Yeah.
These space stations.
Yeah, the space station above Earth. Really nice shot. Establishing where he is.
It's a really good shot. From what I was reading, it took a third of their visual effects graphic for what is basically a 20-second shot.
Not super expensive for what really just amounted to about 5 or 6 seconds.
Which is utterly irrelevant. It didn't need to be very at all. It didn't. It's a ship that we never see. It's a station we never see again.
Yeah, it's a station we never see again. Welcome to Space Cadets, everybody, where we get words wrong.
Exactly. So the quickly transition from this up to the Lewis and Clark, the sort of research vessel that was hinted at earlier, or rather the search and rescue vessel, I should say. And we get a very cursory introduction to people here, but I think we'll save it for a bit later when they sort of have an introduction proper. They go into stasis. Again, the ship's venturing to Neptune, so they go into stasis. All seems to be going well, but then Weir prematurely wakes up from stasis, and what happens when he does that?
So he wanders around for a bit, and everybody else is still asleep, and you're thinking, well, that's a bit strange. And then, yeah, he encounters... I'm going from memory here, my memory's a bit vague, but he encounters someone, his dead wife, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the encounter's not great, because... No, it's been a while since they've seen each other, and she's missing her eyes.
Which you do hate it when that happens.
It's a bit of a radical change. I mean, it'd be different if she came back with a different hairstyle, but no, she decided to get rid of her eyes. So of course he wakes up very soon after.
Yeah. And he's being sort of, obviously very distressed. The crew sort of try to offer him some degree of sort of comfort and try to calm him down by offering him coffee, which is nice. And you get some banter between the crew, some just general back and forth. If anyone who's watched Aliens, and I assume most people have watched Aliens, if you hadn't, you are vile heretics. But if you've watched Aliens, this is basically basically it really does the sort of opening aboard the Sulaco when everyone comes out of hypersleep. Just general sort of back and forth between the crew.
Yeah.
And then we get to the... I suppose what we'll do here is we'll introduce the crew at this point, shall we? I think that's probably a good idea.
Sure.
Yep. Yeah, you seem to be, when it comes to sort of the characters, you seem to have it far more adept than I.
All right, let me just find what I've written. Okay, so I'll start with the captain and work my way down. So, again, Captain Miller, played by Lawrence Fishburne, he's a very sort of by-the-books captain, very straight-laced, has a job to do, and will do it to the highest professional standard. He leads his crew with pride, even as things sort of start to go a bit sour. His character is very much driven by the need to just make sure that everyone's alive. I mean, that's a given the kind of film, but there's a particular point to that we'll address later. Then we have Dr. William Weir. He's the designer of the Event Horizon. He's a bit naive. He comes across as a bit naive and inexperienced in the kind of work that Captain Miller's crew do. So he stands out a bit like a sore thumb. And his character evolves in a very interesting fashion as the story progresses. Moving on then to Peters, played by Kathleen Quinlan. Her character was very interesting, purely because she is the most fleshed out of all the supporting characters. Her role seems to be multifaceted, even though she's listed on the IMDb cast list, as MedTech Peters. MedTech, I guess, medical, technological, that sort of thing.
Who also they charge with deciphering logs, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
Probably with Peter's just good to establish in the sort of opening scene with the crew. It is established that she has a son, and there's obviously she's had to leave him with an ex-partner, and there's obviously some sort of tensions there with her child and so forth.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was referring to. I said her character is more fleshed out than all the other supporting characters, in that they do seed a very core element of drama, specifically with her character.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, moving on to Lieutenant Stark. She is the ship's XO and essentially Miller's shadow, bar a few sort of witty comebacks directed at Miller. She really spends most of the film just echoing everything he says and does, which I didn't like, but I'll talk more about that later. Then we come to Cooper. He's a stereotypical comic relief character. Okay, he makes the jokes. The witty remarks, the off-color, inappropriate comments.
If you've watched the film, you know what we're referring to there.
Yep. Yeah. So, but he also, there's an interesting part to his character that I'll mention later, that I quite like, because it's a common trope in most horror films that I think annoys a lot of people. It annoyed me the first time I watched this movie as a kid, and pretty much every time since. So it was nice to see this trope sort of played against.
Mm-hmm.
And then we come to Justin, the young crew member. Would have been good to have his character maybe be a bit naive and inexperienced like Weir, but of course he had two of them, and it's sort of like ends up becoming a buddy system kind of a deal, and we can't have that. So he's sort of just there.
Yeah, and I'm pleased that he's a character that really gets fleshed out, and we really get to explore and follow throughout the film.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, he's the linchpin in the whole thing.
Absolutely.
We come to DJ, played by Jason Isaacs. Now, I've always been really fond of Jason Isaacs. And this character almost, for me, didn't do him justice, but it's just enough to make him interesting.
Mm-hmm.
He's sort of gloomy and irritable, obviously intelligent and capable, and unfortunately very situationally relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have Smith, your rough and simple pilot. He's a bit rough around the edges. That very, I wouldn't say Cockney, but almost.
Close to it. He's British, and they do play on that, I think.
Yeah, they definitely do. Again, his character is another one that didn't really get much, so it's difficult to really describe him all that well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll talk more about that later on. But that pretty much covers all the characters.
Yeah, that's all. Like I said, it's not a huge cast. I think 7 of them, I believe.
Yeah.
So it's not a sizable cast. But that's probably for the best, as we'll get into. So after we get introduced to the entirety of the crew, we get sort of the general sort of sci-fi exposition scene as they're sort of approaching their destination. So long and the short of it is the Event Horizon. It was sort of publicly released that the Event Horizon was just a research ship that disappeared. In reality, it was a secret government program, as these so often are, to develop faster than light travel. And everything seemed to be going well, but then something went wrong. And again, the ship did disappear, but the source of that and reason is completely unknown. Weir is, we learn, on board because he designed the Event Horizon, or specifically designed the gravity drive, which is basically the sort of conceit this film has as to how fast a light travel is possible. It's without going too much into it, it's one of these situations where instead of the ship accelerating to the speed of light, it bends space-time around it. So it's, again, rather than Moses going to the mountain quite literally comes to Moses. As a scientific point, it isn't technically inconceivable. It's the sort of thing where it's theoretically feasible, but just we have no way you would even begin to know how to construct a device that would allow you to do this. That's where the science sort of sits. And the whole thing of the exposition is basically the event horizon suddenly reappeared 7 years after its initial disappearance in orbit around Neptune, and the Lewis and Clark and her crew have been sent to essentially explore it, and to see what the situation is, why it disappeared, and all the rest of it.
What happened to the crew?
And along with the reappearance of the event horizon, they also received a little message, didn't they, Crazy?
Oh, they certainly did, George. Yeah. It's a sort of message that if any reasonable person heard it that didn't have a job to do would listen to the pain screams, the weird Latin, and would just turn around and go home.
Exactly. So it's basically horrendous, cacophonous, screams and evil, and then some fellow in Latin saying, what was it, levite me, or something like that. Liberate me. Thank you. That's why you're here. You perform the role, the DJ character in our podcast.
I'm situationally relevant. I pop in and out.
Yeah,
only when needed.
And won't read an fortune send at all.
No, there's no one behind me, is there?
Yeah. So DJ realizes that there is this Latin, someone is speaking Latin in this intercepted message, and it says, save me, or he translates it as being save me, which obviously gives the crew reason, despite all ominous overtones, to make full speed towards the event horizon. Just as a side note, it's established that it was the NSA that picked up the initial transmission. I love the fact that no one there, in future NSA had the ability to realize it was Latin and translate it. Or maybe they did and they just didn't tell the crew.
We need someone to go out there that's not us. It's almost as if the whole NSA team just sat there going, bags not.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so we then get the scene with them approaching the event horizon. It's so the ship is, again, it's a very, I'll get to what the ship looks like in a moment, but it's in orbit around Neptune, sort of in the upper atmosphere, which means there's lightning and storms, not a haunted house at all. The ship now, the Lewis and Clark comes in close and approaches the event horizon, and there's sort of a scene with a degree of tension. They sort of build up tension with, obviously quite a rough approach. And when they eventually dock, it's after, having undergone some quite significant turbulence. I think it was a good scene. It sort of built up tension, but de-escalated it quickly in a way that obviously ultimately had no bearing on the ultimate story.
Yeah, and I mean, that's perfectly fine. It wasn't like it was good tension in the fact that it really didn't have anything to do with the horror and the nastiness to come. Just sort of for a moment you almost feel like, oh god, is this going to be where they lose someone? But then of course they say to wrap it up.
Yeah, and it shows that the crew are quite professional and very proficient as well.
Yeah.
Cool. So we then get aboard the event horizon. So they sort of dock, they go on board. Now, okay, I suppose we'll describe each bit in sections. So Captain Miller ends up in the event horizon's medbay. So how would you describe it? The event horizon is basically a very long ship. You have essentially two sections, the sort of front of the ship and the rear, connected by an incredibly long sort of central corridor. And so it's a very elongated ship in that sense. Most of this stuff, sort of the med bay and the bridge, are in the front of the ship, and the rear is reserved for engineering, which, as we'll see, holds the gravity drive and the sort of the whole reason for the ship's being in that sense. Cool. So do you want to go through sort of each of the characters as they're exploring different parts of the ship, Crazy?
Okay, Miller and medbay.
This is...
Yeah, I'm struggling to remember sequences.
Yeah, and this is actually a thing. We'll get to this in the sort of final review, but there is actually a reason for this. I mean, with regards to writing and pacing. So as I recall it, Miller is in the med bay, and this is where he makes the not ominous remark at all that this place is a tomb.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, because they're sort of on board. There's no gravity. It's very cold. They find there's no one on there, but Miller is accosted by a hand.
Yes, of course. Miller's making his way through the med bay, minding his own business. It's all seeming kind of, as he put it, tomb-like, but otherwise fairly normal, until he screams suddenly, and then this frozen hand just sort of innocently spins off in the distance.
He's he's caused the hands, please. It's caused a jump scare, and it just goes off, along its way.
Yeah.
Then we have Peters, who ventures to the bridge, and we get a wonderfully anachronistic thing, which is the ship's logs on a CD-ROM. Yes, yes. I love those anachronistic things in sort of older science fiction films.
Welcome to the future.
Exactly.
Do you have your compact disc?
Indeed. Oh dear, on their Walkmans. So she pulls out this sort of CD from the CD drive, which again wouldn't be an issue if you had Wi-Fi on there, just saying. And again, a jump scare. She sort of pulls out the disc, is thrown backwards because we're in zero G environment, and she encounters a corpsicle.
Yeah, frozen human corpse with no eyes. Again, the eyes make an appearance,
or rather lack thereof.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, lack thereof. Yeah.
Yeah. So we get the indication that everything aboard Event Horizon is not well, and it's also in this scene, I should say, with Peters on the bridge, that she sees a small piece of blood on one of the consoles, and then remarks, "Oh, it's a small bit of blood," and then sort of on the wall behind her is sort of illuminated by sort of flashing lights, and we see that the whole wall behind her is just covered in entrails.
Yeah, it almost looks like vines of blood have painted that area of the wall.
And it's a wonderful technique which comes up again, and I'll point out when it does, where we as the audience are sort of subtly introduced to something that the characters don't realise that we see before the characters do.
And that's brilliant, because it stops it from feeling really expositional, which can and slow things down a bit.
Yeah.
It's smooth as opposed to clunky.
Exactly. So then we move on to Justin, young Justin, who is exploring engineering. And engineering, as we said, is sort of a location where we find the gravity drive. Now, do you want to have a look at sort of describing the engineering deck, Crazy? Because it's not what one would expect.
No. So, of course, Justin's sort of walking through the tunnel, and he comments on it being a bit like a meat grinder. I think it looks like a cylindrical cheese grater. But, of course, that sort of follows on from Miller's comment. And then he gets into the room proper, and it just looks weird. Like, it's a very unique room to every other part of the ship. It gives one the impression of it being very sort of, what was the word I used?
I think you described it as ancient, almost.
Yeah.
In some sense, ancient and alien.
Ancient and alien, almost like you'd expect to find it in a tomb somewhere.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't look human.
It doesn't, no, because you expect sort of a faster than light drive to be very technical or something very sort of industrial, very scientific, and it really is not. The room is very stylized. That's the word. I think it seems to resemble a temple more than sort of a room in a spaceship almost.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So they've taken, and again, you see this in other parts of the film, but beyond particularly designing the engineering deck, rather than sort of focusing on practicality or the scientific accuracy, they created something that, again, it looks almost like a shrine or a temple in terms of its design, rather than, again, sort of a practical piece of machinery in a spaceship.
Yeah, exactly.
So what does being sort of the bold spacefarer of Justin is, what does he decide to do?
He decides to boldly go where no sane person would ever go, and he gets himself sucked right through the portal in the middle of the gravity core. Am I correct?
And Yeah, which isn't great.
No,
Certainly isn't.
because he's screaming. It's messy, and yeah, Cooper to the rescue.
Yeah, so Cooper, who sort of was described previously as rescue technician, sort of runs from Lewis and Clark into the event horizon down towards the engineering to try to save Justin. He manages to, well, he kind of pulls Justin out, but it's sort of more almost a case where Justin was ejected rather than pulled out.
Yeah, so Justin sort of floats back, all kind of limp, almost just sort of floating back, and Cooper catches him.
Yeah, so all seems well, and then the gravity core emanates this large shockwave that permeates through the event horizon and the Lewis and Clark, causes significant damage, particularly to the Lewis and Clark, causes the hull to rupture. Generally just bad things, by all accounts.
Yeah.
So long and the short, there's actually two things I will point out here. Nice sort of cinema aspects of cinematography. Firstly, when the gravity core activates, it sort of reinitializes gravity throughout the ship. The corpuscle that we described earlier falls to the ground and smashes. And it's just, I really like sort of the effect about this corpse, this otherwise normal corpse just falling to the ground and smashing like a piece of china.
Yeah, no, that was quite interesting and satisfying in a weird way.
Exactly, and it does look fairly gruesome as well. And then also in the core, it's sort of revealed there is oil or sort of coolant fluid just floating around in the core. That, when gravity is reinitialized, that which has previously been in sort of floating globules just cascades down in sort of, in liquid form and creates very nice sort of effect and contrast. So everyone has to sort of abandon the Lewis and Clark due to the damage caused, for the venting atmosphere. And so they reluctantly decide they have to venture aboard the event horizon. And this sort of creates a nice transition, I think, between the first and second acts of the film.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Yeah, it establishes sort of the stakes for the second act. So they have to... Yeah, so the second act essentially starts with them in the bridge explaining that we need to repair the Lewis and Clark, and we only have 20 hours to do so because... CO2, I think, isn't it? But basically, the amount of CO2 scrubbers in the event horizon aren't working, and so they'll suffocate essentially in 20 hours.
That's right, yeah. So that sets the time limit.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this is, it's sort of from this point onwards where things, again, obviously things have gone quite badly with Justin in the core. Justin, by the way, comes back and is just completely comatose. There's just completely unresponsive.
Yeah.
Still alive, but just unresponsive. And this is when things start to go just a little bit funny, isn't it? At least for one person in particular.
Ooh, things go funny. Things have been going funny already.
Yeah. So what happens to Peters in the med bay?
Well, Peters experiences a rather odd hallucination. Sounds and noises beneath a green cover. When she pulls it back, she sees her son, weirdly enough, sitting on one of the tables, just casually, like, okay, that's normal. Yeah, and that was a bit unsettling for her, I think.
It was, distinctly, because, by most rationale, her son probably shouldn't be aboard a creepy spaceship, in orbit around Neptune, probably.
It's like her dad just dropped her off. His dad just dropped him off.
Yeah, exactly. He's yours now, you take him. My time's up, you take him at the weekends.
Yeah.
So we then, after that hallucination, we then get just a very brief digression where the initial log, they sort of decrypt part of the Event Horizon's logs, and it's basically the crew just before the sort of things went wrong. Everything seems to be going quite well. We note that the captain of the Event Horizon is sort of sitting there and speaks Latin.
That's right, yeah.
Which, might relate to something, who knows. And he's just, he just sits there, does some Latin. And then we then get basically a repeat of the message at the beginning where it all goes sort of distorted and evil. I don't know how else to say it, really.
Yeah, there's some nastiness that follows in that.
But they're not quite at the point yet where they've deciphered it entirely, are they?
No, certainly not. Thankfully.
Oh, not yet. Right, so I'll leave the next bit to you, which is I think we'll take next the next set of hallucinations, shall we, from both Weir and Miller.
All right. So I think it's Weir first, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Weir is in the core room.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's some strange nastiness going on there with some malfunctioning bits. So he goes in to check them out and fix them. And as he's doing that in the small, cramped green space surrounded by motherboards, you should have here, but his wife, just to really ratchet up the fare a little bit.
Mm. And then the lights go out.
Yeah, and then the lights go out, and that's not a lot of fun. That's a bit spooky. And then what should happen next, George?
Oh God, this is horrible. Yeah, at this point, George is looking away from the screen. I am not good with horror films. So as soon as the lights go out, I'm like, nope, I'm just looking the other way and hiding behind the sofa.
You can't do that. You're reviewing it. You have to watch the whole thing.
No, it's a credit to the filmmakers, damn it. I have to torment myself and come back traumatized. So he basically, it's one of these scenes where he turns a torch on and shines it, and he doesn't see anything, and he shines it back, and his wife's suddenly behind him, and George has a heart attack. Again, she's sans eyes, as seems to be the fashion. Then I think she says something to the effect of, "You can stay with me forever," or something.
Yeah, I can't remember the lines myself, but
yeah. And then at the same time, Miller, who is sort of in the core chamber but outside of sort of the area where Weir is, also has a hallucination. He sort of hallucinates this burning man rising up from sort of the coolant fluid, and yeah, it's he's suitably sort of unnerved by that as well.
Yep, because that points to some nastiness yet again.
It certainly does, doesn't it? So then the crew so we've had three people, Peters, Weir, and Miller, who have now had hallucinations. So the crew decides to do sort of have just a nice little conversation about the situation. Try to relieve some of their stress over it. But that doesn't really serve that purpose, does it, in the end?
No. Doesn't really fix anything with anybody. It kind of simmers a bit and everybody buggers off, but no, you're right, it doesn't resolve anything.
And I think it's at this bit we start to get sort of the indication that Weir might not be... Things might be off a little bit with Weir, we start to realise, because he doesn't respond when the others explain their hallucinations. Weir chooses not to discuss his.
Yeah, no, that's right.
And we just start, I don't know, it just starts to get sort of a subtle indication that things, he's obviously... Because we as an audience know that he had this hallucination, but no one else does. So obviously there's some reason why he's concealing it from everyone else. It's at this point now. I want to take a look at this scene quickly. So this is the point at which Justin disappears from medical, and the shot they use to show this is fantastic. It's probably my favourite, and by my estimation, the most iconic shot of the film. So you have Justin in sort of the foreground on one of the beds with Peters in the background, and Peters sort of walks past Justin's bed to the other end of the room, and the camera tracks with her. So we sort of look at her, and then Justin goes out of frame. Peter stands at the other end of the room for a few seconds and then walks back. And as she walks back, obviously the camera tracks with her. And as Justin's bed comes into view, we realise he isn't there.
No, he done gone.
He's gone. And it's another wonderfully subtle way of raising tension without relying on a jump scare or something more derivative.
Yeah.
It really builds that up. But she doesn't really have time to sort of she does see this, she does sort of briefly realise this eventually, but she doesn't really have time to process it, does she?
No, because she's almost immediately called to the fact that Justin... Oh, no. Sorry, I'm skipping a moment. Mm-hmm. Even before that, she spies something that is, again, very freaky, and sends her running from the medbay.
Yeah, you just hear this loud sort of banging as if something's approaching from the other end of the room, and she does the only logical thing, which, to be fair, is a good thing a character should do at this point, and flees.
Yeah, she runs. She's like, Miller? No, she actually runs.
Yeah, she runs. She doesn't walk towards it, which is I commend her for that. She runs and ends up in the bridge, but the thing, it's great. It's one of these things where she meets people in the bridge, and they're like, "Why are you running? It's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Nothing's here to get you." And then something bangs on the door bridge, the sort of sealed door, to the point where it distorts the metal.
Yeah.
And Weir acts a little funny in this scene as well, doesn't he? Because he's in the bridge with them.
Yeah, he's like, oh, that must be the well, that just must be some innocent person. Let's let them in.
Yeah, Weir, in a very sort of detached way, starts to walk towards the door and go, we must let them in. They have the pizza I ordered.
Yeah.
He doesn't say that, but he doesn't.
You must wondering what he was thinking, but yeah, he stopped just in time, and he doesn't end up opening the door, thankfully.
No, and then yeah, and then I think it's fair to say at that stage that things go from sort of bad to worse, because then we have the scene with Justin and the airlock, which I'll give to you, Crazy.
Yeah, so obviously, as we know, Justin's gone a bit of a walkabout, and after the scene in the bridge, he suddenly emerges in an airlock, and he wants to get out. Everybody shows up right away. First by Peters, and then everybody else arrives to try and talk poor Justin off the ledge. While this is happening, Miller has actually gotten himself into a little spacesuit, and is sort of climbing across the neck of the ship towards where the airlock is, to catch Justin if he should fly out. Then what happens? Yeah, they're not really succeeding in talking him off the ledge. The air starts to flow from the room. Justin lifts off the ground. His eyes start to bleed out. And then he's thrown out and caught by Miller, who is very intelligent and planned ahead. Brought back into safety, but yeah, at this point, Justin is a little worse for wear.
I think as DJ ultimately describes it, it won't be pretty, but he'll live.
Yeah, which is the main thing.
Just as a small side, that's a nice little scene, but the portrayal of decompression isn't too bad. The one thing I would say is I think they do play on sort of the blood and the physical harm he experiences perhaps a little much.
Yeah.
I think really, yeah, if someone was in that position, you would expect some sort of distortions and sort of rashes of the skin, and maybe some sort of pain in sort of extremities, but you wouldn't expect like eyes to sort of just disintegrate or blood vessels to all pop at once or something like that.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not a terrible depiction. There are much worse out there, but it probably just plays on sort of the more macabre aspects a little too much. But otherwise, not too bad scientifically.
Perfectly fine scene, yeah.
Yeah. Then we get Miller's backstory. So as we know, Miller has sort of been perpetually haunted by the image of this sort of burning man. No, literally a man, consumed by flame. And he then speaks to DJ and has a sort of brief discussion with DJ, explaining that at this point, the man he sees was a bosun. The man he has been seeing was a bosun on a ship where Miller was serving, called the Goliath. There was a fire aboard the ship, and Miller was sort of standing at the escape pod, and had to make a decision as to whether or not he would leave this man or try to save him. And Miller ultimately decided to leave this man, to die a fairly gruesome death, because to do so would have risked the lives of everyone else on the escape pod.
That's right. Yeah.
And clearly, this is one of those sort of decisions that have haunted Miller for very long time.
Which is the whole reason for his no crewman left, but no crewman dead sort of thing. But at the same time this is happening, well, in the same scene, I mean, DJ confesses he's made a mistake with the initial translation of the transmission, and elaborates that, well, eventually he does sort of just say it, and I'll find it for a second. He mentions it in its totality as, well, this is a Latin message, liberate tutum ex inferis, which means save yourselves from hell. So no longer save me, save yourselves.
Yeah, so at this sort of opportune moment, DJ comes along and goes, "Oh, by the way, I translated that message, or I sort of, realised we'd been translating it wrong, and it's not great."
we should probably go.
Yeah, and then as if to reinforce that point, we then get they then end up in the bridge because they've now fully deciphered the Event Horizon's log, and how do you want? I'll give you this scene to describe, Crazy.
Okay, so it's a lot of very violent mutilation, physical mutilation, and a lot of really sexually charged violence as well. You're not given too long to focus on it, but just enough that you can actually make up that that's kind of what's happening. And it's so utterly nasty and grotesque that when it finally ends, and we get a shot of everyone's faces, it rests on Miller with the only reasonable reaction.
I love this line. So again, this horribly macabre scene has ended. So basically, the crew of the Event Horizon were just dismembering each other, having frivolous sort of final days of Sodom sort of sexual encounters, eating each other, horrific. And the film that sort of log ends, and you just go to staring at the sort of camera looks at the Lewis and Clark crew. Miller looks up. There's complete silence for a few seconds, and then he just says, "We're leaving." It's how he says it. It's such a matter-of-fact way, as if it's not, sort of debatable point. It's just a fact of the universe. That after seeing that, after listening to that, they're going to be leaving.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that sort of acts as the transition into what I would call the it's sort of the third act. I think that's the first sort of transition point. So the third act begins with they've realised everything's gone to hell. This is not a good place to be. We need to make a prompt egress.
Yep. But of course, as Miller's quite resolute in getting off the ship, there are a couple of lines that I think represent quite nicely the division the beginning of the division between Weir and Miller, with the words, "Weir, you can't leave my ship. Miller, fuck this ship."
Yeah, this is really when the division between Dr. Weir and Miller, which we've seen growing throughout the entire film, this is where sort of schism exists and develops. It just can't be reconciled.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's sort of at this point of the film that things really start to pick up in pace as well. So we'll probably, I think, try and get through this as quickly as possible, because it's one of these scenes where there's just a lot of action and things sort of coming to a head.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so we start off with Peters and Smith go into engineering to get some CO2 scrubbers. However, just before leaving, Peters is sort of transfixed by the core and also sees a visage of her child again. The child causes her to basically go up into the gantry, sort of above the core area, draws her out over a ledge, and she's sort of transfixed by her child and doesn't see a gaping hole before her. So Peters quite tragically falls to her death. A wonderful reminder, A, that the Event Horizon needed safety railings, and B, do not follow creepy children.
No, both perfectly good points.
Yeah, so Peters is gone. Peters actually the first. Incidentally enough, depending on how you consider Justin, Peter actually the first death of the film, which for a horror film is quite interesting because it's quite late in the piece.
Yeah, that's right.
The first death. So Peters dies. Shortly after Peters dies, Weir, who at this point is sort of acting in a very, very strange fashion, Weir sort of ventures into engineering, sees Peters, is a bit upset. But then we get a sort of flashback with Weir, if you want to take this one, Gracie.
Right, so at this point, Weir goes full weird and experiences a total hallucination of the moment his dear wife took her own life. It's a particularly confronting moment for him, but then, of course, she gets up and holds him close and basically says, "You can stay with me forever, you just have to do one thing." And so he rips out his own eyes.
Exactly. Yeah, which I say is commitment to a relationship. I mean, that does show commitment. It's the sort of thing where if a year you want to get divorced, it's going to be, you're going to feel like a bit silly, aren't you?
It's a bit like getting their name tattooed on your thing.
It's completely like that. It's exactly the same. Perfectly analogous. Yeah. So Weir has the flashback. One thing I will add is, again, I know we want to get through this quickly, but there's a really, again, it shows Claire's suicide, and it's established. We know that his wife is dead. We've known that for much of the film, but we didn't know how she died. And again, the suicide is shown quite graphically, and I think it's a very powerful image, and it's something that as an audience who knew she was dead, we probably weren't expecting something quite so visceral.
Yeah.
I think it does introduce quite a bit of shock for the audience. So as Crazy said, Weir has now gone full weird. He takes, this is one thing we forgot. So, okay, basically along the central corridor of the event horizon, there are explosives, and the explosives were put there so that in the event there was an accident in engineering, you could destroy the central corridor, and that would sort of separate the two halves of the ship. Engineering would sort of go into the void or be destroyed, and the crew could use the front of the ship as a lifeboat and escape. So Weir takes one of these explosives and places it aboard the Lewis and Clark. And this is where we get sort of Smith's moment of attempted heroism in the film. Crazy.
Yeah. Sorry. So, of course, Miller's alerted Smith to the fact that there's a bomb on board, and instead of just getting off the Lewis and Clark, Smith tries to locate the bomb, and he does so just in time to see the final few seconds of the countdown before he is vaporized, along with the Lewis and Clark.
Yeah, and what happens to poor Cooper?
Oh, that's right, and Cooper, who was working on the outside of the Lewis and Clark at the time, is sent hurtling into space.
Yeah, presumably never to return.
Presumably.
Yeah. And then immediately thereafter, Miller sends a warning to DJ, who is in medical, just getting some final supplies, saying, look, Weir has destroyed the Lewis and Clark. He's clearly hostile. Be careful. And DJ's like, don't worry, sir, I'll take him out. There's no way he can get, there's no way he's going to be able to accost me or anything.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, he's wrong.
I'll give this to you, Crazy.
So of course, DJ's standing there like, yeah, no worries. If Weir shows up, I'll handle him, easy. What he didn't know was that Weir was already standing behind him, and I mean, if you imagine a frog in those sort of typical dissection sort of scenes, DJ is the frog.
Yeah, we have anatomy. Once he sort of just incapacitates DJ, we have anatomy class with Dr. Weir. And it's literally, so basically DJ just ends up suspended sort of above one of the gurneys, his entrails sort of falling out all over the place, and that's the sort of macabre scene that welcomes Miller when he comes to investigate.
Yeah, exactly.
So at this point, Miller decides, okay, something needs to be done now.
Yep. So at this point, Miller is very well aware that he's not going to be winning Captain of the Year. He's lost a few crew members now, and is realizing he is going to have to confront Weir. So he moves to the bridge to do just that and finds Stark unconscious on the ground. Goes to pick up Stark, but the weapon he took with him is gone. He tries to get Stark out of the bridge when they are both stopped by Weir, who is sitting in the captain's chair.
Mm-hmm.
Weir's like, no, you can't leave. This is where, of course, he reveals his intention to take the Event Horizon back to where it came from, where it returned from. What else happens here?
Well, so basically, Weir sort of says, we get one of the best. So Weir's basically said, the ship has been to hell or something deserving of that name, and I want to take it back, go for a nice holiday. And this is where we get sort of, I think, what is the most iconic line of the film, which has been turned into a meme, I believe, which is where we're going, we won't need eyes.
So that's at this point we learn that Dr. Weir is a Back to the Future fan.
Exactly. he really wanted to be Doc Brown. And so it looks like Stark and Miller are done for. Then something very unexpected and convenient happens.
Yeah, the return of Cooper,
who has been out in space. We've saw in a scene previously that he sort of tried to use jettisoned air from his oxygen cylinder to essentially try to throw himself back towards the event horizon after he was blown off by the explosion. So Cooper comes crashing through against sort of the bridge's viewing window. Weir suddenly turns in sort of shock, fires one of his sort of javelin things the weapon he has, which punctures the window. Cooper is sent flying back off into space.
Poor Cooper.
You do have to feel sorry for him at that point. The bridge decompresses. Get through this quickly. So the bridge decompresses. Ultimately, Weir ends up being thrown out into space after trying to hold on. Miller manages to escape the bridge and just manages to save Stark, who should have been thrown off into space as well. Really, she was basically thrown unconscious by or incapacitated momentarily by Weir, and there's no way she would have been able to hold on. But it's fair enough. Yeah. So Miller and Stark managed to leave the bridge. Weir hadn't been thrown into space, and then they hear that someone is approaching through the airlock.
So someone's there at the airlock. Miller and Stark are like, holy crap, Weir's back. Oh, damn. But surprisingly enough, it's Cooper who emerges through the door. And we're all like, yay, Cooper's alive.
So we now have the survivors are Miller, Weir, and Cooper. Not Weir, sorry, or is it? But we have Weir, Stark, and Cooper, who are these. Oh, for God. Oh, God.
Miller, Stark, and Cooper.
Thank you, Crazy. See, this is why he's here. Welcome to Space Cadets, where we completely garble character names and make the synopsis incomprehensible. Yay. So we have the three survivors who basically, Weir, before dying, activated the gravity drive, which would send the event horizon back to hell, or to the unpleasant place, with all the cannibalism and orgies. So they decide they need to get off the ship and use the method described previously. They're going to destroy the central corridor with the remaining explosives and use the front of the ship as a sort of lifeboat. So Miller goes out to arm those said explosives. And what happens to Stark and Cooper while Miller's gone crazy?
Right, so it's at this point the ship is flooded. Parts of the ship are flooded by strange red liquid, and the elevator blood from The Shining decides to make a cameo appearance in the film.
It does. It sort of turns up, realizes, oh, sugar, sorry, wrong movie, and then pisses off about as quickly as it arrived.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is. It's this interesting scene because as described, basically, Stark is just drenched in this torrent of blood which sort of just emerges. And I think the reason they did that is specifically because the film was actually sort of advertised, and when they sort of were going for funding, it was actually positioned as being The Shining in space. Yeah. So I think that's a not too subtle ode to that fact. But it's one of those strange scenes that the more you think about it, the more it doesn't make any sense because nothing comes of it. All that happens is, again, literally, Stark gets drenched in blood, and that's it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not really a threat or anything. So while that's happening, Miller goes to arm the explosives. He succeeds, but then just before he returns back, the sort of the immolated man turns up again and forces Miller into engineering. And it's here we have sort of the final confrontation, if we will, if you want to take this scene, Crazy.
Final confrontation, right. So the Burning Man is revealed to be Weir. What notes did I have on that? Okay, just trying to find my notes.
No, it's fine. And as you see here, ladies and gentlemen, we see the podcaster in his natural habitat, frantically trying to locate his notes to describe the scene. We're a professional operation here.
Yeah, not fledgling at all.
No.
Okay, so the situation reaches its most critical point as the final act is played out, a fight between a mutilated Hellspawn Weir and Miller, who have emerged as both hero and villain. So that was a pretty nasty fight scene.
It was. It was a situation where I think Weir certainly had the upper hand for the majority of it. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, Weir was definitely winning because you have to, really.
Exactly.
But in the end, Miller grabs a hold of the detonator, and much to Weir's dismay, disconnects the front end from the back end, saving his crew while basically sacrificing himself and condemning both him and Weir to their hellish nightmare.
Exactly. It's. I think again we've talked about this before. When Miller destroys the ship, I think it's left a little ambiguous as to whether the ship goes back to hell or not.
Well, it's certainly no
or if
longer
it's destroyed.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of left somewhat ambiguous, but at the very least, he sacrificed himself for the rest of his crew. At the very least, if not condemned himself to a horrific existence.
Although I would argue that if we were meant to be aware of its destruction, we'd see some kind of exaggerated 90s Michael Bay-ish explosion.
That's very true. No, that is a fair point. They wouldn't be able to help themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
So the survivors, Stark, Cooper, and Justin, who's in basically sort of one of the stasis pods, are saved. They venture back to Earth. There's a rescue team who sort of come on board saying, we found the event horizon. And what happens now, Crazy?
Right, so the nightmares never cease. Stark is woken by one of the rescue people, and is sort of helped up, and she's like, she's panicking. He's like, no, you're fine, you're gonna be okay, you're all safe. Flips up his helmet to reveal that it's actually Weir.
Dum dum dum.
Yeah, dum dum dum. Right. Stark is snapped awake, and it was all a nightmare. She's freaking out as the actual rescue team is trying to calm her down, and Cooper's there like, we're good, we're safe. Of course, he would know. He spent most of the film almost dying. Yeah, and that pretty much concludes the film. As the doors of the room seal ominously over them.
Yeah, it's one of these sort of quite traditional sort of ominous yet largely ambiguous, but with a slightly ominous sort of overtone, which is quite characteristic of films like this, I think.
Yeah.
And then it slowly fades out, having set that ominous tone, and then we get reminded that this was made in the 90s.
Yay, just some rock music playing at the end.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure why, Crazy, maybe it's because you're slightly older than me, but I think you are somewhat more accepting of this than I am, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I think, like I say, with these kinds of movies, especially horror movies, it's very normal to have that kind of soundtrack playing at the end.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I think you are just a bit more accustomed to it than I am, but it was one of those things where I just was like, oh, okay, that's not expected. And at the end, we get the greatest horror of all 90s rock music.
Well, it wasn't all bad, but...
Very good. So we fade away, and we leave the event horizon in the distance. All right, then, everyone. So having looked at the synopsis, which hopefully sort of gave you some insight into our views of the film, we'll move on, I think, to sort of the review proper. I think it's good with these sort of things to start looking at sort of the overall theme and sort of purpose that was clearly sort of being demonstrated when the film was made. And my sort of reading of the theme is really this sort of narrative is underpinned by the notion of loss and characters having to reconcile themselves to that sort of sense of loss, and it sort of explores how people, I think, deal with loss differently. Yeah. And it sort of uses the characters of Miller and Weir to illustrate that. And I know you've looked at quite a lot of characters, Crazy, so I thought you might want to sort of have a look at how each of the characters sort of deals with loss and overcomes, or in one case fails to overcome it.
Yeah, so I think really the only two characters of note in that sense are Weir and Miller. Again, we do have Peters, who has her son. As I said, she seeded quite early on this connection with her son. So when she is killed off by that hallucination at the end, we're not feeling betrayed. But when it comes to Cooper, DJ, Justin, and Smith, they almost might as well not have been there. Justin is okay; he has an excuse because his eyes exploded. And this is not meant to be an indictment of the actors, but the characters and the way they were used. Smith, for example, has very few lines of relevance. Him and Cooper are missing throughout most of the film, and really, Smith's position could have been filled by a bloody much loved teddy bear with a few lines. Cooper, I would keep just because, he's the stereotypical African American character who just doesn't die, which is great.
Yeah,
and
it defies expectations, doesn't it?
It does. It defies expectations. And then we have DJ, who I described as being situationally relevant, and that's really all there is to it with DJ, because honestly, once he fully decrypted the message, he was dead. But yeah, again, Weir and Miller, very quickly we get the idea that Weir is a bit of a dork, a bit different to the rest of the group, and the distinction between him and Miller becomes increasingly clearer as the film progresses, until, of course, the moment when you realize that Weir's off his nut and Miller wants to go home.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the issue of loss and reconciling yourself to loss, I think those two characters illustrated in the way that, so we start off with, again, I think the narrative can be viewed, in one sense at least, as an increasing divergence between Miller and Weir and the positions they take. So although they both start at the beginning still very unreconciled to loss, obviously with Miller, the sort of boatswain aboard the Goliath, and that haunts him clearly, and clearly with Weir, his dead wife. But as the story progresses, the ship and their experiences aboard the Event Horizon compel them both to confront that loss, something that I think both have probably tried to avoid up until that point. Whereas Miller is ultimately able to overcome it, to accept the sort of loss of that bosun and to acknowledge it, which he, in the final scene, he quite literally does that. He literally says, I know the bosun is dead, or something to that effect. And Miller ultimately is shown to be triumphant over his loss and his anxiety, which allows him to then sort of sacrifice himself to protect his crew. In contrast, Weir is shown to be someone who gives into his grief and surrenders to his sort of trauma and his suffering, quite literally in the case of obviously surrendering to his wife and losing his eyes in the process and his mind. And it shows sort of that ultimately, if you allow yourself to sort of be overcome and succumb to that sort of suffering, in the end you will ultimately be destroyed by it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's coincidental. I was reading about it, and I found that sort of head writer for the script, he had recently experienced a loss, quite a sort of tragic loss.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that sort of plays very much into the idea that obviously he was that sort of loss and the experience that was reflected in how he wrote the script.
And that's very interesting that he would do that. That's, very good, very interesting, because it lends itself quite nicely to the story.
And it plays through. I completely agree with your assessment of the other characters as well. I do think they were underdeveloped. Now, I suppose there's the excuse that the film, when all is said and done, the film is basically 90 minutes long.
Yeah.
And it's not a long film, by modern standards at least. And so you can argue they didn't have a time to develop more. If you look at Peters, Weir, and Miller as sort of the three developed characters, they really didn't have a lot of time to develop the other characters.
Yeah, exactly.
You can understand that, but I think you are right that to a point they do just serve a function, and so their deaths are not as impactful as they might otherwise be. Yeah,
and there's really not a lot to say about them.
No, Stark is particularly telling because of the survivors, she's sort of portrayed as being, of those that survive, the three characters that survive, she was portrayed as being arguably the sort of the important one, sort of the principal character of those who survive. Yet, again, we only mentioned her in a review towards the very end because she really has very little to do throughout the story.
As I mentioned in the synopsis, she is essentially Miller's shadow. She only really becomes important when Miller dies in the last 5 minutes of the film.
And that's an area that we spoke about character then, and that's probably one character who should have been fleshed out a little more. Again, if you're going to have her assume the mantle of sort of the principal character at the end of the film, it doesn't mean that the audience has to have followed them throughout and they have to have been developed from the very beginning, but I think it does mean at least in the second half of the film, more should have been done to develop them a little more.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, the analogy I came back to, and we've discussed this before, would be Ripley in Alien. Now, from the beginning, she clearly is not the principal character. I think it's only towards in the latter half of the film, after Captain Dallas dies, that Ripley becomes, a much more central feature of the film. So that by the end, when she's the only survivor from the Nostromo, you do feel as though she, about her, and you feel more for her ultimate survival, I think, because you feel you have a greater attachment to her as a character.
Yeah.
And I don't know, they might have been going for that idea with Stark, but for whatever reason, it just didn't translate on film because she was not developed enough. So moving on from characters, I think something has to be said about the artistic direction and style of the film.
Okay.
Which I really liked it because the Event Horizon as a ship, we've sort of described it briefly. Outside of the core, which, as I said, it's very much like a temple. It's very sort of different. The ship itself has a very sort of naturalistic, very industrial feel. It isn't Star Wars, it's not sort of clean, refined, very sort of sheer sort of surfaces. It's very, very, very sort of industrial and rough. Again, it almost looks like you're in times. It almost looks like you're more in sort of an industrial plant or something rather than a spaceship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that aesthetic, I think, plays really well into the story, and it creates, I think, a really interesting. I think it makes the ship slightly more ominous in many respects.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Because it doesn't. Because I think sometimes, like the ships, if you imagine, say, a horror film set on a ship in the Star Wars universe, I don't think it would seem quite as foreboding or necessarily dark or macabre as it would on, say, something like the Event Horizon, which, again, as a ship, it looks like it was designed to be a little unsettling. And I mean, actually, in the canon of the film, it almost looks like those who designed it wanted it to be unsettling for the crew. So that's my little diatribe about the art direction, because I think it's, and also I can't avoid mentioning this. Those who have played the Dead Space video game series, which you have, haven't you, Crazy?
Well, yes, I played the first 2 games.
Those who have played it will notice a significant amount of influence from Event Horizon.
That's right, yeah, actually.
I think it's unavoidable because it's not only do you have the aesthetic carried over, so the Ishimura, which for those that know is sort of the principal spaceship in the first Dead Space game, the Ishimura in many of its design aspects is also very industrial, very naturalistic. It lacks any sort of nice refinement that is often characteristic of sci-fi spaceships. Again, that sort of aesthetic was carried over, and also in the elements of the plot. I mean, in Dead Space, the principal character is, pursuing his sort of deceased, we don't know she's deceased, but eventually deceased wife. There are sort of hallucinations. There's, again, a sort of quasi-paranormal aspect to it, which obviously is the case with Event Horizon. So I think, a lot of sort of, I do think a decent amount of horror films and science fiction films have either explicitly or just implicitly been influenced by Event Horizon in some way. But Dead Space for me is just one of those things where I was watching Event Horizon this time and it just stuck out like a sore thumb. It really did come across it just how much the sort of developers of Dead Space took influence from Event Horizon. It really sort of shows. Actually, I think the first Dead Space was about a decade. It was made in sort of 2007, 2008, so about a decade after the film came out. And yeah, I think it's just nice to see how other elements of popular culture sort of capitalize upon each other and sort of obviously are inspired by things like Event Horizon and previous works.
Yeah, it's nice to see when they do stuff like that, that when it's not obviously just straight up biting, but actually legitimately inspired by.
Inspired, and take it further as well, which I think Dead Space did. It took those arts and they sort of took in a slightly different direction, because obviously there are no, I mean, depending on how you read it, there aren't really many monsters per se or creatures sort of roaming the ship, but obviously that's the case with Dead Space. So it's nice that they took those sort of inspiration and put it in a slightly different context.
Yeah, exactly.
Marvellous. So I think what we've decided to, we debated a long time about how we were going to actually sort of sum up the films. And we decided we'll use a very original 0 to 10 scale, which, we should really trademark that. So the last thing I want is people to sort of take it as their own.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So we'll use a 0 to 10 scale. But once we've done that, we will also recommend whether we each think you should stream, not that we encourage that, rent or buy a particular film. And then finally, we will also each just take a moment to make sort of one recommendation as to how we think the film could have been improved upon. So do you want to have a first crack at it, Crazy?
All right, so out of 10, I would absolutely give this film a 7. Despite my criticisms of it, I genuinely enjoyed this film enough to watch it several times over the years. It's a sort of movie where if you're into sort of space science fiction horror, then you absolutely should buy it. Otherwise, if you're maybe sort of on the fence, definitely stream or rent. And there are legitimate streaming services out there, so if you can spend $5 to watch it, then I feel like you really should. But I wouldn't begrudge anyone who doesn't. And as for the one improvement I'd make to the movie, it's hard to say, because I feel like one small thing would mean a cascading effect, and you end up having to change a whole lot of things. I would at the very least write the Lieutenant Stark character a bit differently, make her a bit more individual without having her stand off against Miller too seriously.
Yeah. No, excellent. Excellent. So you're done, Crazy?
Yep, sorry, I'm done.
Cool, excellent. So I'm in almost complete agreement with you. I would give it a 7 out of 10, a solid 7 out of 10 as well. Again, if we were doing sort of half ones, I'd give it a 7.5, but I don't want to get into that because that's just a slippery slope if we go down that route,
isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. So I'll give it a solid 7 out of 10. Overall, I think it's a really enjoyable film. As we'll probably explore as the series goes on, I have a huge weakness for sci-fi horror, particularly sci-fi horror on a spaceship. If you give me a derelict spaceship, I'm going to be happy. So the Event Horizon is right up my alley. I really enjoyed it as a film. The only thing that stops it getting sort of higher views in my mind are the things we discussed. And also, I think you can almost still describe it as somewhat of a B film. It aims for a certain level and quality, and it achieves that, but it just doesn't aim for anything higher than that, if you see what I mean, Crazy.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah, it just doesn't quite aim for higher. So I think they were aiming for roughly about a 7 or 8 out of 10, and I would happily give them a 7 out of 10. It's still very enjoyable. Again, as Crazy suggested, if you're someone who enjoys these type of films, you've probably already seen Event Horizon, but if you haven't, I would strongly recommend renting it. Absolutely. I think if you have any sort of partiality for horror or science fiction or space films, certainly rent Event Horizon. Even if you're someone who doesn't necessarily like these films, I think streaming it or even renting it is still an option. I think it's definitely, like I said, it's only 90 minutes long. I think it's a film that certainly is worth your time, and you can just, even if you don't want to look at it too deeply, it's a film you can just watch and derive just base sort of enjoyment from. As to an improvement, again, the film is 90 minutes long. I would suggest, if I was to think about it, what they could have done in order to promote better character development and also to sort of break up the pacing of the things like, because what you get in the middle is you get a lot of sort of vignette scenes, a lot of scenes with a few characters happening all in quick succession, and it is quite a lot as you might have seen through the synopsis, we sort of had to remind each other as to where certain scenes took place. To sort of add as a grounding point in sort of somewhere near, say, the beginning of the second act, it would have been really good to have just one sort of sequence, maybe 10 minutes long, where all of the characters had to come together and do something collectively. So, for instance, I don't know, a coolant leak threatens to destroy the reactor, or, there's a large oxygen leak, or something that requires all of the characters to come together to solve a problem collectively. And that would, A, I think, change the pacing somewhat. It would, B, give the audience a little bit of catharsis somewhere in the second act before everything really starts to fall apart. And also it would, I think, it would just promote the characters and give you a little bit more insight into how the characters work, which then contrasts well with later on in the film when they all start dying off. So yeah, that would be my sort of improvement, is just some sort of an extra 10 or 15 minute scene where the characters come together to sort of solve the problem collectively.
Agreed, yeah.
Yeah, so that's it, Crazy. That's the first film, Event Horizon. I think it's definitely worth people's time, and yeah, I again, just go and see it if you haven't seen it already and you have any interest in the genre. I think you certainly should.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more.
Marvelous, very good. So we get back aboard our spaceship and as the characters make as prompt and egress from that slightly unsettling ship as possible, and the Event Horizon, with all its sort of ominous overtones, sort of fades gently into the distance as we begin searching for another film to captivate us.
Absolutely. And that pretty much sums everything up.
Exactly. Okay, then, everyone. Hopefully that went well and you're still with us. Again, if you chose to stick through it, it's your fault at this point. You were warned. I think we gave you enough warning. Thank you greatly if we did. We're both terribly appreciative. I think it's fair to say we both came across fairly positive about Event Horizon in the end, and I think it was a really good sort of film to start our sort of journey into the unknown cosmos with. So again, hopefully it's a film you also will be inclined to go and watch now if you already haven't.
No, absolutely. You should go see it, I think. But certainly, if you have any opinion about the movie so far that you maybe want to tack on in a comment or whatever, that'd be good too. If you appreciate what we're doing, you can even, any small gesture like a like or a follow or anything like that would certainly help us. Will certainly help encourage us to keep going, I think. And hopefully we'll get better as time goes on and not sound so fledgling and flattish. But
Crazy will. I will still sound terrible as we go on, but Crazy will improve. Yeah. I'm always going to be terrible.
Well, either way, come what may, we would also appreciate suggestions for films to watch that meet the sort of conditions that we're looking at the moment in terms of space-oriented science fiction.
Mm-hmm. So anything that sort of fits within that neck of the woods would be greatly appreciated. I think, like I say, we want again. We don't want to just choose films that we all, that Crazy and I want to do, because if we did it that way, Crazy would do sort of, continuously horror sci-fi, and I would do strange French films from the 1940s that no one's ever heard of.
Plus, it also means that we're not simply watching movies that we know we like.
Mm.
We're actually sort of taking in suggestions and then going away and maybe looking at films we haven't actually seen before.
Yeah, exactly. So again, thank you everyone on behalf of the Space Cadets podcast. Thank you all for listening. Do whatever it is the kids these do nowadays to show their appreciation or disdain, as that might be. Mm-hmm. And again, we thank you a lot, and hopefully we'll be able to review another film in the not too distant future.
Indeed. And with that, goodbye, internet humans.